Well, welcome to the program again to our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. I'm Amarachi Ubani. We begin with the reactions to U.S. President Joe Biden's surprise visit to Kyiv today. Earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described talks with his counterpart as very fruitful. Other European leaders have hailed the visit as a reaffirmation of U.S. support for Ukraine. For Ukrainians who fled the war, the visit is a message of hope that one day they too can go home.
The United States President's visit to Kyiv was probably known to not only Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, but also to the Russian president, as the Kremlin confirmed it was informed about the visit. Air raid sirens blared across the Ukrainian capital as the United States President visits, but there were no reports of Russian missile nor air strikes. The visit comes a day before Russian President Vladimir Putin was due to make a major address expected to set out Russia's aims for the second year of what he now calls a proxy war against the armed might of the West. Both Biden and Zelensky visited a memorial for fallen Ukrainian soldiers. The Wall of Remembrance features thousands of portraits of soldiers who have died since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. After holding private talks, both leaders addressed the press. President Biden announces a further $500 million worth of weaponry, including artillery ammunition, anti-armor systems, and air defense radars, plus tighter sanctions on Russia.
It was 1 year ago this week. We spoke on the telephone. It was very late at night in Washington, very early in the morning here in Kyiv. Russian planes were in the air and tanks were rolling across the border. You told me that you could hear explosions in the background. Don't forget that. And the world was about to change. I remember vividly, because I asked you what is there, Mr. President? What can I do for you? How can I be of help? And I don't really remember what she said to me. She said, and I quote, "Gather the leaders of the world, ask them to support Ukraine."
President Zelensky tells him the visit was an extremely important sign of support for all Ukrainians. He also highlights U.S. support for Ukraine so far in the war.
Together, we've committed nearly 700 tanks and thousands of armored vehicles, 1,000 artillery systems, more than 2 million rounds of artillery ammunition, more than 50 advanced launch rocket systems, anti-ship and air defense systems, all defend Ukraine, and that doesn't count the other $500 million we're announcing with you today and tomorrow. That's going to be coming your way. And that's just the United States in this piece.
And as both leaders leave Mariinsky Palace, walk into the Alley of Bravery, President Zelensky shows Biden a memorial plaque bearing his name.
And I think it's very important. So
what a great honor.
Thank you very much.
What a great honor.
Thank you very much.
Kyiv residents say they were left speechless and joyful after the surprise visit. Some speak about the unexpected but joyful visit. One says she was brought to tears. Others are shocked, as there was no information of the impending visit. Analysts say President Biden's visit is a good boost to morale for Ukrainian troops, as it's not about the hardware they have been promised, but the message that the visit sends and the confidence they can have.
Well, the U.S. president has added a brief stopover in Poland to his itinerary, a move the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock says is important and in Germany's interest. She told a news conference earlier today that Poland, as Ukraine's neighbor, plays a decisive role in supporting arms shipments. adding that Germany's friendship with the United States has rarely been as close as it is right now. Well, as we already mentioned, this week marks the first anniversary of the war in Ukraine. And while the country and allies worry Russia is planning a major offensive, residents in Russia have been reflecting on how President Vladimir Putin's decision to send troops into Ukraine has impacted their lives. Some commented that the conflict has brought added anxiety and fears of the future. Another respondent says although she cannot physically feel the impact of the conflict, she felt it in her soul, heart and head. Others said they were simply adapting and getting on with normal life. And more from Russia, though. The Defense Ministry claims forces have captured the settlement of Paraskeva in eastern Ukraine, located about 10 kilometers north of Bakhmut, has seen a fierce fighting between Russian and Ukrainian troops. Russian forces have besieged Bakhmut since July, when they captured two major towns farther north. Russian troops spearheaded the Russian Wagner Group mercenary force have made incremental gains in nearby villages, and fighting has engulfed its northern districts in the past few days. But Ukrainian military analysts say that the town, protected by a river and wooded areas, has considerable significance in pinning down Russian occupying forces. Bakhmut is in the front line of the Donetsk region. It's had a pre-war population of 70,000. But now Ukrainian officials estimate that fewer than 5,000 civilians remain there. And European partners to Ukraine in the war believe the Union needs to ensure Ukraine has enough ammunition to continue the fight. Just before stepping in for a meeting in Brussels, foreign ministers expressed their support for Ukraine and skepticism about China's announcement it would outline its position on a possible political settlement to the Ukraine war. A Chinese foreign ministry said earlier today it is willing to work with all parties to continue efforts to realize peace in Ukraine at an early date, reiterating also that a nuclear war must never be fought and can never be won, a warning that the longer the war protracts, the more the world should not give up efforts to strive for peace. And of course, that China is willing to work with all parties to continue efforts to realize peace at an earlier date. I want to bring in security expert Chidi Warner, who joins us now from London. Chidi, great to see you. And it's just a few days to the first anniversary of the war in Ukraine. Do you think that Russia is still preparing for that major offensive, having only admitted it recorded major losses in the war?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on. I would say, yes, Russia, I wouldn't say they're preparing for the offensive. The offensive has started. What we're seeing now are, I think we're actually beyond the shaping phase of the offensive. So if we break it down into, the actual shaping, which is maybe what we would describe as, initial actions to get ready for the main bit, which we would call the decisive phase. I think we're kind of beyond that. So there's been a series of offensives in different areas, being to Uledar or the infamous Bakhmut and other areas, which would indicate that, Russia is putting in quite a significant effort, is devoting, brigade-sized units to these attacks. So I don't think the offensive, there is another offensive beyond this. The question we need to ask is how is Russia planning to sustain this offensive? And if it doesn't achieve its objectives, how is it going to continue? Because the key problem we have is, the key problem the Russians have is that whilst they have more troops than the Ukrainians. Theoretically, they have more artillery. They've got more tanks. They don't have the number of trained personnel that the Ukrainians have. They don't have the amount, the kind of logistics that the Ukrainians have. And that's a double-edged sword, because the Ukrainian logistics is much more complicated because of the wide variety of weapons that they've got. But they're operating on what we call interior lines. So they're operating on their own territory with on ground that's familiar to them. So for the Russians, their biggest problem is going to always be, if they're not successful or they don't get, immediate success, do they have enough troops, enough tanks and enough ammunition to continue what they're doing? And if they don't, do they have the intellectual capacity to undertake a different type of offensive using maybe maneuver rather than, just brute force and firepower?
Yeah, and they're making great gains in Bakhmut. Let's talk about President Joe Biden's visit to Kyiv. Quite unexpected, wasn't it? It was just last week that President Zelensky said he wished that President Biden would visit Kyiv. So do you think that his wishes came true? Was he really just predicting what he already knew, that the U.S. president will be making this visit this week?
I would assume that he most likely already knew these kind of things would be planned quite intensely, especially considering you're flying into an active war zone. There will be a lot of work that would have gone around this. But, the symbolism is important. When you have somebody of the stature of the important, a US president he comes with a huge security bubble, a huge infrastructure with him. So a US president arriving anywhere is a big deal. But arriving in an active war zone that's being targeted and a capital that's being targeted daily by, an adversary that's as sophisticated as Russia, that's not a small thing. And the symbolism won't be lost on anyone. The US is essentially saying we're in this for the long haul. So we've been having, there's been a whole load of Russian narratives throughout this past year, a variety of them from, the West is weak, the West is failing, the West is going to abandon Ukraine. I think what's being made clear by this visit, if it wasn't clear to anyone before, is that the West or the US is not abandoning Ukraine, that, they will continue this level of support. And that then, again, there was also an element of, I wouldn't say trolling, but, Biden showing, I'm not afraid of the Russians. Doesn't matter how powerful they claim to be. I am still happy to walk around this capital without, despite, them being able to bomb it. So it's a very powerful symbolic gesture, but at the same time, it's underpinned by quite significant material and financial supports from the Americans as well.
Yeah, I quite agree. And Russia was informed of this visit as well, because even while the air raid sirens went on, there were no attacks during the time of President Biden's visit. But how do you think the Russians really are interpreting Biden making his way to Kyiv, actually being on the ground, and they just carefully watching his every move and listening to his statements at the press conference?
Yes, well, I mean, so just, going back, the Russians would be informed to an extent. They wouldn't be given the itinerary, but they will be told either X, Y, Z will be in the area. And that's essentially a way of saying, put a box around this area and don't fire anything into it, because obviously that will be an escalation. So it's in everyone's interest. It's in America's interest. It's in Russia's interest for there to be nothing to happen to Biden while he's there. I don't think anybody, I think we all understand the implications of something happening to Biden if he's in Kyiv, especially if it's by Russian actions. But the way they will view it is quite, from the political point of view and the military point of view, their biggest kind of effort, other than the military side, is to divide Ukraine from its Western supports. That is Ukraine's vital ground. Without Western support, Ukraine will be reduced to fighting, a guerrilla action. It will be like an Afghan or Iraq war, and it will go on for decades, rather than what we're having now, a kind of a peer one-on-one conflict. What this tells them is that, that effort to divide the West from Ukraine is not succeeding. It doesn't matter, what's put out there, whether they claim the Americans blew up Nord Stream or they claim that the Americans are laundering money to Ukraine. All of this has fallen on dead ground. The Americans are in this war. The Europeans are in this war. And, all the stuff that we're hearing nowadays about ammunition running out, I mean, I would say take it with a pinch of salt, but, weigh it up against what the Ukrainians are most likely planning to deliver to the Russians. This is all part of the shaping for the Ukrainian operation to pretend, or at least to insinuate that the Ukrainians don't have the equipment or don't have the resources they need for the offensive, maybe to try and lull the Russians into a sense of false security. It's not from a strategic point of view, it's not a positive outcome for the Russians, but nothing has happened today that they didn't know already. Everybody knew the Americans were involved. All of this is just a confirmation. If they had any hope that they were going to be able to divide the West from Ukraine, I think what today's visit has shown is that that's very unlikely to happen, that the West is in this until the end. And it's now the key question for the Russians is, what is the end? Is it a Russian victory, or is it a negotiated settlement or a Russian withdrawal?
Yes, and I think that for just one day, Ukrainians can appreciate the fact that there were no missile attacks, especially in Kyiv, bringing some peace and quiet. But more weapons were promised on this visit, at least $500 million worth of them. The EU has once said that Ukraine was going through weapons really fast. And, these tanks and ammunition take time to build. How much longer do you think the military aid can go on?
Let me say, I don't know how to say this without being controversial, but there's always money for war. So they will always find money or anything that if there's, if there's money for anything on this planet, there's always money for war. So I don't think that there's a risk of this equipment not being delivered. As you said, the key issue is time. The time that it takes to produce this equipment, or the time that it takes to train people on it. And it's not just training the crews, it's training the maintenance crews, it's training the logistics staff, and it's also getting now the spare parts, the ammunition for all of this equipment, and the production runs for it. So the factories that make, the ammunition for these weapon systems, make the parts and make them themselves, they're all in a kind of a steady state right now. Either they're not manufacturing or they're just manufacturing a certain batch. They need to speed up production or expand their production lines in order to sustain this war effort. And that's where the big time comes in. But I think, again, another thing we need to be very clear of, everything that you hear being spoken about now in terms of tanks, artillery, that's all for maybe 6 to 9 months down the line. Everything Ukraine needs now at this particular point in time is already in theater. Everything they need for their next offensive, to defend against the Russian offensive and to undertake their own offensive is in theater. A lot is made of, we need tanks, we need tanks, we need tanks. They have the tanks they need. What they're talking about is tanks for their summer offensive or their autumn offensive, rather than tanks for now. And, a lot of it is lost in what we're talking about. There's a lot of talk about, aeroplanes, them needing jets. Jets will most likely be delivered one day. But while they talk about it now, they have a reasonable understanding that that's not going to happen until maybe a year or 2 years down the line. So you're right that time is a factor, but it's not a pressing factor. If in about 6 to 9 months you still haven't seen any of these tanks on the ground, then that's when one would start to worry. But right now, at this point, I think the Ukrainians have what they need. It's just, are they going to use it properly? Are they going to be able to use it properly to defend against this Russian offensive and also to launch their own counteroffensive when they're ready?
Yeah, but you do hear the Ukrainian president speaking urgently, matter-of-factly about needing these weapons, almost like he needs them now. And of course, the time factor does play a role in this. Thank you so much, Chidi, for speaking with us on The World Today.
Thanks for having me.